Welcome back to Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. I'm Jack Llewellyn. Thank you, as always, for joining me. And also, thank you for putting up with some of the vagaries of scheduling that occurred during the holiday seasons. I'll just leave it at that. Today, we're going to talk about two specific topics. First, we're going to look at the current situation in Culiacan, but we're going to frame it slightly differently than we have in the past. Second, we're going to look at some reports, stories, rumors, hypotheses, characterize it how you will, regarding Joaquin's betrayal of El Mayo, which of course led to El Mayo's rendition to the United States, his subsequent arrest in the United States. Before we talk about either of those, though, I want to start off with a little bit of news from last week. So last week, President-elect Trump nominated Ronald D. Johnson to serve as the U.S. ambassador to Mexico. First of all, it's important to note that this Ronald Johnson is not the Ron Johnson who is the Republican senator from the state of Wisconsin, which I will say was a source of tremendous confusion the first time when it was announced. But Ronald Johnson is significant and noteworthy in a couple of respects. Number one, at the end of President Trump's, or the last 17 months of President Trump's first administration, Mr. Johnson was the U.S. ambassador to El Salvador, and there are some glowing reports and stories of his relationship with people in El Salvador. So there's that. It's also interesting to note that he was a Green Beret who then went to work with the CIA during the period from, say, 2013 to 2017. He was a special advisor to the U.S. Southern Command in Miami, managing collaboration between the command and the intelligence community, the State Department, the CDC, the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and other agencies. Right before he was appointed to the position, the ambassador's position in El Salvador, he was the CIA's science and technology liaison to the U.S. Special Operations Command in Tampa. It's also interesting to note that he has lived in Latin America, and he also speaks fluent Spanish. So that's Ronald D. Johnson, the likely new U.S. ambassador to Mexico. I will note that, at least from my own point of view, Mr. Johnson is significantly more qualified and more likely to be a successful ambassador to Mexico than at least some of the people who were rumored to be up for the ambassadorship. I won't name them, but I will say from my own perspective, is very relieved to see Mr. Johnson's name as opposed to some others. Okay, let's talk now about Culiacan. As I've mentioned in the past, you can spend a good portion of your day, every day, looking at social media and news reports and things and seeing stories of violence and gunfights and gruesome brutality in and around Culiacan as part of this continuing civil war between Los Chapitos and the Mayo group. One thing that I think is highly underreported, at least in the United States, and maybe not thought of enough, is the human cost for the average citizen, the average business owner, the average student in Culiacan. And I want to talk about that for just a couple of minutes. I've also told you in the past, I spend a fair amount of time looking through news reports in different sources, a lot in the U.S., but a lot in Mexico too, and looking right at newspapers and other sites that are focused and have reporters in Culiacan, have reporters in Sinaloa. Thank goodness for Google Translate and other translating services that allow me to read these newspapers in real time. I saw a report, it's a week or so ago, and it was actually talking about something that happened in the last week in November, but this really struck me. And the report said dozens of band of musicians gathered outside the Culiacan Cathedral in the capital city of Sinaloa to play Mexican regional music and raise funds in the wake of unemployment and business closures caused by the recent wave of cartel violence. The main event consisted of 20 music ensembles, including mariachis and others from the banda genre of regional Mexican music. So that got me thinking and looking a little bit more at the economic toll. Certain reports have said that the ongoing war within the CDS and the violence around Culiacan has really brought the local economy to its knees in a way that is very similar to what happened in the pandemic. According to the Culiacan Chamber of Commerce, more than 30,000 people have lost their jobs since the violence began, and that represents about a third of all social welfare recipients. The thing that I think is important to note and to realize is how the violence has affected all aspects of daily life. Many companies have reinstated pandemic-area remote working. Many schools have gone remote. And I think the evidence, both tangible and anecdotal, on the effect on students during the pandemic of going remote is frightening. And to see it reinstated in a place like Culiacan is sad and tragic. Even such things as soccer or football, as they say. The second division Dorados de Sinaloa Football Club, which Diego Maradona, by the way, coached in 2018-2019, has temporarily relocated from Culiacan to Tijuana, some 1,500 kilometers away. So think about that. Isn't that crazy? You can't even have a soccer team in Culiacan now, or the major soccer team, because of the violence. The report suggests that since the violence started, Mexican businesses in Culiacan and the surrounding area have lost more than $1 billion. B with a billion with a B. B. Jose Manuel de las Rivas, who is the head of the Hotel Association in Culiacan, said that hotels are at least one half empty. Many owners pondering suspending operations or declaring bankruptcy. Numerous other businesses, including shops, restaurants, and the like, have also suffered tremendous losses, leading to many going out of business, whether temporarily or long term. There was an article with a restaurant owner who talked about the fact that on a normal night, his business would see 20, 30, 40 people. But if there were any reports of violence, it would go down to 0 or 1 or 2 people. And, that's a discrepancy and a reduction that businesses just can't adapt to. While this is all going on, what have the The officials in Culiacan said, well, I have a quote here from the Public Safety Secretary, Omar Garcia Harfuch. He says, we have made high-impact arrests. This situation will be resolved, but it is not going to be solved overnight. We have an intense display of Army resources in Culiacan, the Navy in Mazatlan, staffing highways to guarantee safe transit of people. We will continue the buildup and specific operations to detain those who generate violence. I'm not sure how anybody else reads that, but if I'm in Culiacan facing all these economic issues, and that's what I read from the public safety secretary, I would not be filled with confidence or optimism. All right, so that's the situation in Culiacan. Now I want to talk about this story regarding Joaquin, El Mayo, and El Chapo. Two things preliminary to those discussions. First, my own opinion on Mexican journalism. And I say this having friends in and people that I respect greatly working in Mexico as journalists who I think are phenomenal journalists. There also appears to be a sector of Mexican journalism that is inclined to report, I don't want to say rumors, but less sourced information. And that probably is absolutely no different than in the U.S. if you took all the newspapers and semi-publications and, you go back to the days of, I guess maybe they're still around, the National Enquirer and things. And on that note, can we make one thing clear? If I say something to Bob, I heard X. Bob repeats X to 3 people, and then they all report on X. And Bob then says, well, of course X is true because 4 people reported on it. The 3 people I talked to and Jack. The fact that it's the same thing gets repeated doesn't give it new credibility. You can repeat a lie as many times as you want. It doesn't convert the lie, the rumor, the innuendo, the hypothesis into fact. So be careful, whether it's with respect to this particular issue that we're going to talk about, whether it's in your daily life, reading newspapers or columns or whatever. Independent sources can corroborate each other. The same thing being repeated is not self-corroborating. I also want to just spend 1 second reminding everyone of the El Chapo timeline, because El Chapo figures into this. So if you remember, his second arrest was in 2014. He escaped from Altiplano prison on July 11, 2015. He was then arrested for the 3rd time and the last time in Los Mochis on January 8th, 2016. He was extradited to the U.S. in January of 2017. He was convicted in court on all counts in February 2019, and July 2019 he was sentenced. He is now in Florence, Colorado at Supermax, just down the road from me, and he will probably stay there for the remainder of his life. So now here come the allegations. And I'm going to read some of this directly from reports in Mexican media. And we're going to look at this in a couple of different ways. It gets a little bit windy, so hopefully we'll take it slow and you can follow the winding logic here. So the report, and this comes from InfoBay, and if anybody wants direct citations, I can give them to you. But the report says the Sinaloa cartel no longer exists, at least as the criminal organization we knew in recent decades, is a phrase repeated by journalists who are experts in the investigation of drug trafficking and organized crime. The trigger? The alleged betrayal of Los Chapitos at the hands of Joaquin Guzman Lopez to kidnap and hand over Ishmael El Mayo Zambada to the United States government. He was called El Guerrero or El Guerrero Moreno. He was the one with the lowest profile among his brothers, Ovidio, Ivan, and Jesus Alfredo. He also felt the most intelligent, according to statements by Mini Licenciado, and he was the only one of the narco juniors, heirs to Chapo Guzman, who was willing to surrender to the United States. Okay? Keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. That the whole endeavor to bring El Mayo to the United States rested not only on Joaquin getting the trust of El Mayo and following through on the plan, but it also required him to give himself up. And even more, let's think about this for a second. Initial reports were that El Mayo was lured onto the plane and he and Joaquin were going to take the plane to visit or overflight of areas of property they may buy. So something similar to that. They both got on the plane and got on the plane kind of voluntarily. Subsequent reports, including statements allegedly from El Mayo since his arrest, have indicated that he being El Mayo, was tied up, thrown in the back of a pickup, driven to the airfield, and then put on the plane. But it wasn't just that he was put on the plane and they said, take off, go. Joaquin stood on the ground and waved goodbye. Joaquin was on the plane with him. So think about that as we go through this. Now, again, most of this information comes from El Licenciado. Most of you know who he is. We can talk about him in a few minutes if we want. But some of this information comes from him, from a journalist who had interviewed him at some point. We go way back in time, some unspecific point in time. El Chapo and El Mayo sat down with all of Los Chapitos. They also sat down with Mayito Flaco, and they proposed an idea. And when there's a little bit of discrepancy here, and I'll give there's another kind of way this might have gone down and when it might have gone down. But this direct story says El Mayo and El Chapo said, hey, what we should do is all give up together. We've got really good U.S. lawyers. We can get great benefits and great deals if we turn ourselves in. When you read between the lines, it doesn't appear that this was necessarily El Chapo and El Mayo saying, we want to go with you. It was more, hey, we're concerned for our children. it would be best for you if you turned yourselves in now. You'll get a great deal, and you can get out of this life alive. Okay. Subsequent story says that the meeting occurred sometime in 2013, which would put it before El Chapo's second arrest, right? Because that was in 2014. So that kind of makes sense. And that it was in El Dorado. And here, the story goes more that the conversation was between El Chapo and his sons, and El Mini Licenciado also happened to be there. Remember that in 2017, El Mini did in fact turn himself in to the police, to the United States. We're going to talk about him a lot more next week, so keep that in mind. So we have two different stories, but the basic idea, the one that runs through both of them, is that at some point El Chapo said, we should surrender en masse because it'll be better for you. It's then said that subsequently, after there was a wave of violence in 2017, 2018, El Chapo again said to his sons, hey, you've got enough money. You should change your lives. You should turn yourselves around. You should turn yourselves in, get the best deal you can. And it is said that the only one who raised his hand and said, you know what, I'll do that, was Joaquin himself. Okay? So we put this 2018, 2019, we're talking about something that may have been, in the works for many years. Apparently, in particular, Ivan and Alfredo said not only no, but hell no, we're not ever doing that. Subsequent to that, you have this situation with El Mini and the fact that he did negotiate with the authorities, and he was able to see kind of how that worked. So that's part of the story, that part of the rumors. Annabelle Hernandez, the journalist in Mexico who has, as I think we all know, a pretty robust network of sources and information, has said that Joaquin was the member of Los Chapitos who was the least interested in the cartel's business, which is interesting because his full brother, Ovidio, seemed to have absolutely or very little interest in it as well. But she goes on to say that Joaquin had been thinking about his surrender for some time. It's also said that he was encouraged by his wife to surrender, and Ms. Hernandez made a point of noting that Joaquin's wife lives kind of outside the world of narcos, whatever that means. It's also interesting to note that of all the Chapitos, he had the fewest charges against him in that District of Columbia indictment that came down right after Ovidio was captured. He is also said to have had a wealth of money stored, saved in places in Mexico. Right? So you put that all together, and you have somebody who now is saying, hey, you know what? I can do two things at once. I can surrender and I can bring in El Mayo, and that's going to be fabulous for me. It's going to be fabulous for my wife, and we'll go on. Here's the next step in this hypothesis, this reporting. If you look at the Sinaloa cartel, there's a great statement here, again, from a security expert in Mexico who says the Sinaloa cartel grew so much that it began to implode. It was already difficult to sustain something of that size. The same thing happened with the Juarez cartel. It was so big that they began to blow it up from within. For years, the Sinaloa cartel had been experiencing an internal struggle. The intelligence forces of the United States infiltrated it to blow it up from within and without. They also pressured the government of Mexico to go particularly against that cartel and began to see arrests at the level of Ovidio Guzman. The one who gave the final blow for the collapse of the Sinaloa cartel, as we have known it since the 1990s, was Joaquin Guzman Lopez, the narco junior who was able to deceive his godfather, the Chapo who evaded justice for 50 years, and on a July afternoon got hung up. And that's the quote from El Mayo when he apparently called his family as part of the rendition to the United States. Now, here's the important part. I think I got preempted on the important part, but here it is. So this comes from Mexican journalist Luis Chaparro, and this was published in Proceso magazine, reputable Mexican magazine, journalism magazine, right? So it says the plan was carefully designed from the cell of El Chapo, who is serving a life sentence in the United States. El Chapo sought to hand El Mayo over to the U.S. authorities in exchange for legal benefits for the Guzman family, particularly for Ovidio Guzman, who had been arrested and extradited to the United States in 2023. All right, so you've got El Chapo sitting in Supermax thinking, I'm going to be here for the rest of my life. He knows Ovidio has been captured, right, and extradited, and he's going to go to trial. The last thing he wants is for Ovidio to have the cell next to him in Supermax, right? So he says, hey, if we could hand over El Mayo, my former partner, friend, whatever, that sure would give us a whole lot of benefits, including for Ovidio. About a year ago, it said a letter was sent from El Chapo to Joaquin that gave him specific instructions on how to set the trap for El Mayo. El Chapo knew El Mayo represented a valuable asset, of course. And more importantly, the capture of El Mayo created a perfect, or would create a perfect opportunity to negotiate with the authorities. So it is said the letter El Chapo sent to Joaquin said, quote, you already know who the targets are. You know what to do. Close quote. Query, and I don't know the answer to this, but I'm actually going to look now, if I can. To what extent is mail from Supermax monitored, outgoing mail? So I'd like to know that information. But it said that after this plan was articulated by El Chapo, that Joaquin approached El Mayo with the appearance of a reconciliation. And we've also heard the reports of, wanting to have El Mayo settle some disputes that were going on amongst some of the government in Sinaloa. And while he's doing this, he also was collaborating with U.S. agents from whichever agency, we've talked about that in the past, providing key information about El Mayo's movements, and then, of course, providing the critical information when El Mayo was on the plane destined for El Paso. We've also seen, and we're going to talk about this more next week, real recent examples of this process working. In addition to El Mini, we've got last week the infamous Colombian drug lord, Juan Carlos Ramirez Abadia, El Chupeta, was freed from prison. Why? Because he gave evidence against El Chapo. He had been arrested, given 20 years in prison, but because he had plea bargained and because he had given evidence against El Chapo, he was able to leave and was freed way earlier than his sentence. Apparently, he's in the U.S. Witness Protection Program, is allowed to have his close family move to the United States and be part of the program. He had testified that he had been kind of the link, or he had provided cocaine to El Chapo, who then moved it into the United States. He also admitted, think about this, he admitted to murdering 150 people and shipping 500 tons of cocaine. Despite this, the U.S. authorities were willing to deal with him because he was a witness in the case to put El Chapo behind bars. Okay. So think about that. He also testified against Jesus Zambada, the brother of El Mayo, and we've talked about that case before. So you've got various examples of this, so you could see why Joaquin might buy this as a viable course of action for him to get him out of the cartel business, to get his wife kind of out of any ties to that world, and to get, to help out his half brother. Okay. Here's the last weird and interesting part. So as we've said, many observers think that the Sinaloa cartel, as it existed when it was run by or involved people like El Chapo, El Mayo, Rafael Caraquintero, El Guerrero, Juan Jose Esparragoza Moreno, El Azul, that cartel doesn't exist anymore, and it's never going to exist anymore. An interesting quote here from another Mexican journalist, Jose Luis Montenegro. That organization could maintain agreements with other criminal groups without the agreements being disrupted, and maintaining a Pax Narca no longer exists. That organization was more lax and friendly to other cartels, has ceased to exist. Now what we have is a fierce struggle for power and to know who has the greatest presence in the country, the most power, and the most money. It's now suggested by Mr. Montenegro, who wrote a book called Los Chapitos, criminal radiography of the heirs of the Sinaloa cartel, he says that in addition to the plan for Joaquin to give himself up and at the same time bring El Mayo to justice in the United States, there is a plan and an alliance that has now been formed between Los Chapitos and El Mencho, which would unite Los Chapitos and CJNG. Moreover, Mr. Montenegro suggests that the most important figure in Mexican drug trafficking going forward is going to be Ivan Archivaldo. And that is to say, in order for Ivan to assume the throne of the Sinaloa cartel and drug trafficking in Sinaloa, he had to destabilize the cartel itself, and he had to remove El Mayo from power. So Montenegro says, I point out that the predominant figure of Mexican drug trafficking is going to be Ivan Archivaldo Guzman Salazar. He is going to remain as the great heir of the cartel par excellence, which will be the Sinaloa cartel, but they will probably change the name of the alliance. Sinaloa New Generation Cartel, Sinaloa Jalisco Cartel, Pacific Cartel, something like that. It's also suggested that proof of this alliance between El Mencho and Los Chapitos is that he requested that Ovidio move to a safe house in Jalisco, owned and operated, etc., by CJNG as a guarantee of this alliance. We also have seen, at least anecdotally, reports of mixed symbology. You know, El Mencho has the rooster. Chapitos have various symbols that are associated with them. And apparently there is more evidence of joint symbology, merged symbology going forward. So let's recap. From way back, El Chapo says, God, you kids ought to get out of this. And if you all go in together, you're going to get great deals. Joaquin says, oh, I'll do that. Ivan Archivaldo say, or Ivan and Alfredio say, hell no, not doing that. El Chapo gets captured for the last time in Los Mochis. He, is imprisoned. Fast forward a couple of years, Ovidio gets captured. Now El Chapo is really worried, and he goes to Joaquin, who had said from the beginning, yep, I'll do that. He goes to Joaquin, if you make if you execute this plan and you do it well, you'll get a sweetheart deal, and Ovidio will get a better deal. He's not going to end up in Supermax like me. Joaquin does that, but as part of that process, talking to his brother, that destabilization, so the story goes, inures to Ivan's benefit, because as the Sinaloa cartel breaks apart, he can form an alliance with El Mencho and become the dominant figure in Mexican drug trafficking for the foreseeable future. That's the story. That's the reports. Let me ask you a couple of questions. and these aren't rhetorical questions, these are real questions. What's in it for El Mencho? What exactly is the benefit of having Ivan and Los Chapitos being associated with CJNG? Now, I suppose you could say it's more territory, less inner fighting. But is that better than letting CDS continue to fight each other from within and picking up the scraps and not having to have an alliance? I'm also curious about, the lieutenants for El Mencho, right? There's got to be a network of people who have served El Mencho loyally for years, and in some fashion or form, there has to be some type of succession plan for El Mencho. He's not old, right? He's 58 or so, but in bad health. So if he passes, there's other people doing things, and also, think about it. How much is El Mencho doing the day-to-day operational activities, or is he, the one at the top who lets everybody else kind of do things, and he has the grander strategy and resolves disputes or things of that nature? But if hypothetically, I'm a lieutenant for El Mencho, I've been working for him for 10 years, everything's great, why would I want to see somebody like Ivan come in and be on a par with El Mencho and above me? How does that make any sense? Not saying it's not true. Okay? Just calling into question the logic of it. And as we all know, just because something doesn't make logical sense to you or me, it doesn't mean it doesn't make logical sense to somebody else. So I'm really interested in this story, really interested to see where it goes, and I'll continue to follow it and provide updates as they become available, or as things that seem to be related arise. Also, very curious what you people think. If anybody else has information or thoughts or anything, please let me know. As I say, I think it's very interesting, and I find the inter and intra-cartel politics extremely interesting. Again, more from a political science, economics point of view, putting aside the obvious illegality and tragedy surrounding the drug trade. All right. That's the topic for today. Next week, we're going to talk about some of these events we're seeing recently of bad people getting great deals from the U.S. and what that means. And more importantly, is it worthwhile? That'll be next week. We've got Christmas coming up. I'm almost certain that there will be an episode next week right before Christmas. So please look forward to that. If for some reason you don't hear another one before the holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, whatever you celebrate. Have a great season. Thank you for everything. And that ends Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena for today. Thanks, everyone.